Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the C2FO webinar Political Outlook, What to Expect on Election Day, moderated by Drew Cantor and Jerod Laughlin. Today's session will cover what 4 potential election outcomes will mean for the American people, as well as how those outcomes may impact businesses moving forward. Because of the number of attendees in this session, your respective microphones have been muted. If you have questions at any time during the course of the event, please use the chat feature located at the bottom of this application window. Our moderators will make the attempt to address your questions as part of the content presentation. And time permitting, they will also address questions that have been submitted towards the end of this event. It is my pleasure to welcome our 2 panelists to the conversation. Drew Cantor is a government strategist with Peck, Madgen, Jones, and joins us with more than 20 years of experience in strategic communications, public policy, and legislative strategy. A former senior Senate Republican leader staffer, Drew knows how the halls of government work and how to navigate the process, substance, and politics associated with the creation of public policy. Jerod Laughlin leads global marketing for C2FO and is responsible for driving revenue growth and increased engagement across the company's customer base. He brings 20 plus years of experience to the C2FO team in global brand development, digital marketing, and omni-channel media execution within the financial services space. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
First of all, I want to thank everyone for joining in this webinar. This election cycle has been unlike anything I've seen in my time. And for business owners, trying to navigate something as difficult as not only COVID, but a changing political spectrum and world is exceedingly complicated. And one of the things that we try to do at C2FO, not only through the content and the articles that we write for our clients and customers, but in the webinars that we produce, is define subjects and information that we can help bring a little bit more information to illustrate in ways that are easier to understand a lot of the problems that face business owners today. And so when we started noodling around kind of what would make an interesting or engaging webinar, our CEO, Sandy Kemper, was like, well, honestly, we should take a look at what's happening from a political level and look at it in such a way that we can sit there and say, okay, here are some of the things that could happen either in a Republican or Democrat administration that would drive legislation that then could impact business owners. And I thought, okay, that's a great idea. The trick to a subject like that is how could we present it in such a way that is as sort of factual and flat as possible, because we are in a very kind of partisan cycle right now. And what we're trying to do through this webinar is not to get you to vote one way or the other. In fact, Drew and I, we honestly don't care who you vote for. We just want you to vote. And so what we wanted to do today was looking at kind of what we see in the amalgamation of some of the polling that's occurring at the national level, at the state level, pull together kind of 4 likely scenarios of what could occur in the election next week, and then walk through what the implications were for business owners, and hopefully we'll lay that out. And then Drew has some specific things that he wanted to call out.
Yeah, thanks, Jerod, and thanks everyone for participating in the webinar. As Jerod mentioned, it's terrific to be with you today to talk about the various election scenarios and how they impact businesses of all sizes. And one thing that we were talking about is that we'd love for this to be an interactive conversation and webinar. And so after each scenario that we walk through, we welcome any questions that anyone might have, and we're happy to address any and all of those.
Yep. Okay, Matt. So the way we've laid this out is we've kind of built a construct around the scenarios based upon what we've seen or what we know in potential polling outcomes. And scenario 1 is a scenario that we call the status quo. And this is essentially where nothing really changes. The House, the U.S. House of Representatives stays in Democrat control. The Senate even if it's narrowly, remains in Republican control, and the White House also stays in Republican control with Trump reelection. Matt?
Yeah, and so 3 of the 4 scenarios would be divided government. And under divided government, as everyone knows, there's not a whole lot of legislation, significant legislation that's enacted. In the first 2 years of the Trump administration, you saw comprehensive tax reform for the first time in since 1986. That was because it was a Republican president, a Republican House, and a Republican Senate. Over the past 2 years, with a Democratic House, you haven't seen much legislative productivity. So like I said, 3 of the 4 scenarios that we're walking through would include that same dynamic. And so when you look at business and taxation, it would be with a Republican administration, a continuation of policies that are deregulatory in nature. And to me, that has had a pretty big impact, at least pre-COVID, on the economic success coming out of several years of somewhat sluggish growth. At the CFPB, you'll see a continuation. Instead of fines and enforcement action, you'll see additional policies that will free up lending and business banks to do what they do best. At the Fed, you'll see a continuation of reform on things like capital requirements and other issues that were included in Dodd-Frank that was passed in 2010 that many banks view as somewhat onerous. At the OCC, you'll see a similar posture of lighter touch regulation. And then at the SEC, kind of the same approach. And when I say lighter touch regulation, I don't mean that there is no regulation at all. That's not to be confused with the term lighter touch regulation, but it focuses on, I think, what works for business, jobs, and the economy versus being overly aggressive. And sometimes in that approach to regulation, things slip through the cracks, but at least from a Republican standpoint, that would be the way that I think you would see a second term of the Trump administration operate. Matt? COVID relief efforts. So you may not have been following the day-to-day negotiation that's been taking place in Washington between the Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, and Speaker Nancy Pelosi, but they've been trying to get there on another COVID relief package before the election. It was finally deemed a few days ago as definitely not possible that they would get there. There could be something that happens in the lame duck, but certainly not possible that something comes together before the election, which obviously is this coming Tuesday. So what we'll see under scenario 1 with respect to COVID relief efforts, you'll see, I think, a so-called skinny package, because there really isn't much of an appetite among Senate Republicans to spend trillions more dollars after the CARES Act was passed in April. You'll see something very similar, I think, to the Senate Republican bill that has been on the floor. They've attempted to pass it. It's been blocked, but you can see its contents. Expanded unemployment benefits, a continuation of the Paycheck Protection Program, which was in many ways a pretty resounding success. Funding for schools, healthcare funding, and then most of all, according to Senate Republicans at least, their biggest priority is liability protection for businesses. The House.
Oh, sorry, Drew. I was say one of the things that was really interesting for me as kind of a bystander watching this process was knowing that Mnuchin was negotiating with Nancy Pelosi almost strictly as an agent of the White House. And then you had Mitch McConnell essentially crafting a bill that was entirely different than the conversations that were occurring between Mnuchin and Pelosi. And so you almost had three different packages kind of sitting out there in a waterfall of it, of kind of, how expansive they were. And no one really knew what was going to wind up or what could wind up in a final bill.
It has been interesting. And the thing that Senate Republicans have been so concerned about is being triangulated by the administration and House Democrats. And in fact, Mnuchin and Pelosi have negotiated a few previous deals. And the administration and the president himself has shown that he is not all that concerned about deficit spending, certainly not nearly as much as Senate Republicans are. And so Senate Republicans are leery of that potential deal that could come to fruition if we see, under scenario one in the next couple of years. But importantly, Senate Republicans and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has said that he won't put anything on the floor that doesn't get the majority of his caucus. So I think that under this scenario, you'll see an administration wanting to spend more money, but resistance from Senate Republicans.
Yeah.
That. So when we think about additional legislative priorities under scenario one, we think about infrastructure. And I am part of a lobbying firm, a bipartisan lobbying firm, and it became a joke in Washington that the administration was having infrastructure week. And then the president would talk about anything but infrastructure. Nevertheless, there is a determination, I think, on the part of the administration and on the part of Congress to come up with some significant infrastructure bill. And that, to me, would be the top priority going into the next Congress under scenario one. Likewise, appropriations. That's the bread and butter of government. Every year they have to fund the government. They have to pass 12 different appropriations bills, funding all cabinet level agencies. So that's something that they must get done and will get done.
Yeah, because the last stopgap budget just runs through December, correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. December 11th. Yeah, so they'll have to, under the current government, obviously, they'll have to get something done by December 11th. And what they'll probably do is pass a continuing resolution, which is just funding at current levels into next year.
Yeah, push another 3 months into February when you've been able to seat both whatever new additions are happening to the House and the Senate.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Jerod. Likewise, Congress needs to reauthorize expiring programs. A number of them, like the Export-Import Bank, the Terrorism Risk Insurance Program, flood insurance, FISA, any number of programs have a finite date and need to be reauthorized. So that's something that even in divided government usually happens. If there's a second Trump term and Senate Republicans control the Senate, Mitch McConnell will continue to confirm judges and executive branch appointees. That's been a big focus of his. That will continue to be a big focus of his. And then an energy package. Lisa Murkowski from Alaska has been working on something on a bipartisan basis. It's possible something comes together in the lame duck. If not, I think that would be a candidate for something that is processed the next Congress.
Do you know what Democratic senator she was working with on that legislation?
I believe Senator Udall from New Mexico, but I'd have to check that because I'm not tracking it closely.
I mean, I would assume that it would have to be another state that had exposure to the petroleum industry relative to their state job base, and that tends to be a small list.
Yeah, That's true. That's a very good point. Any questions?
Yeah. Any questions around scenario one or kind of a status quo shift?
So gentlemen, one of the questions that came in that isn't referenced on the slides is healthcare.
Yeah, that's a great question. And as I think a lot of people know, with the Amy Coney Barrett Supreme Court hearings last week, a big focus was what's going to happen with the Affordable Care Act. Will the Supreme Court strike down part of the law, the entire thing, or leave it untouched? And so that I think will be, or could be, a big issue next Congress. Republicans in Congress have shown that they've had difficulty in forming a consensus around a comprehensive healthcare bill. They've tried for a number of years. They haven't been able to come up with something that's workable. They do support a continuation of protecting pre-existing coverage for pre-existing conditions. That was also a prominent theme during the Amy Coney Barrett hearings. So that will continue to be an issue. What we tried to do here under scenario one is list the issues that would likely have an outcome. And I'm not sure there's going to be a legislative outcome in healthcare if we have divided government.
Healthcare continues to be the single biggest Achilles to the Republican Party. Being a politics junkie, one of the things that I had been doing kind of in the past 2 weeks was looking at political ads in House and Senate races in different states. And one of the things that struck me is that Democratic ads consistently, I didn't care what state you were in, the issue that they were hammering the other candidates on was healthcare consistently. And again, the Republicans have yet to come forward with any type of consistent plan or messaging, which I think starts to symbolize sort of some of the fracturing in the caucus, where you've got different kind of budgetary constraints, you have different views relative to what the role of government is in healthcare. And because of that, it's really hard to form a consensus. And you don't have that level of fracture on the Democratic side. So yeah, no, I think that's going to continue to be an issue for the Republicans. And to Drew's point, in a divided government, without Republicans having control of both Senate and House, the odds of crafting a piece of healthcare legislation that could deal with the concerns, priorities, and stated goals of both parties would be a level of statecraft I'm not sure that we can do anymore.
Yeah, totally agree. Totally agree.
If there's so let's drop into scenario two. So, one of the things that I thought was really interesting is Goldman Sachs dropped a note last week where they took a look at kind of financial markets, and then they took a look at like GDP and the economy. And one of the things that they showed consistently, looking historically, is that the economy does best with divided governments, right? So that when you've got a mix of Republican control and Democratic control, that's been one of the best things for the economy. That when the Democrats control everything and the Republicans control everything, not so good. Which I thought was interesting. You look at the analysis, and it did back it up. And so scenario two is one of these kind of continuation of a divided view. But in scenario two, what you see is what is historically viewed as a blue wave, where you've got House of Representatives is still firmly in control of Speaker Pelosi. You've got Republicans, again, albeit probably with a smaller majority, could even be as small as just one, which would create an interesting situation in ties relative to the role of the vice president. But you've got Republican control of the Senate with Speaker McConnell, and then you've got a Democratic administration with Joe Biden as president. And so that definitely creates some interesting dichotomies and also some interesting potential. So Drew, let's walk through deeper that scenario.
Yeah, so business and tax, when we're talking about what could happen under this scenario, which includes a Biden win, as Jerod said, the Senate continued control with Republicans and then a Democratic House. So, what to look for here would be pretty aggressive regulation across the federal government, particularly with financial services regulatory agencies. The first bullet, the greater use of the disparate impact theory that Democrats feel strongly about. That would be used, I think, at HUD and other agencies. The CFPB would be much stronger and more aggressive in enforcement actions. And you'd find also at the Fed and OCC and other regulatory agencies, higher capital requirements for financial institutions to guard against some kind of future economic downturn. So that's, I think, what you'd see under a Biden administration. In terms of tax, Vice President Biden has talked about moving the corporate tax rate back up. So it was at 35% pre-2017. Then the Trump administration, like I mentioned earlier, worked with the Republican Congress to bring that way down to 21%, in line with the rest of the developed world. What Biden has talked about is bringing that back up to 28% or potentially higher. But that wouldn't pass muster in a Republican Senate. So I think from a tax perspective, you would see largely the status quo under this scenario.
Now, I'd have to think there'd be some effort, well, maybe not a full kind of repeal of the Trump tax plan. I'd have to think that there would be some movement, or at least deal making to probably horse trading around extension of the personal credits and maintaining kind of personal tax levels, and then the tit for tat would be the raising of the corporate levels.
Yeah, I think that's right. I just go back to the fact that senators are going to resist any efforts to raise taxes. They worked hard on tax reform in 2017. I mean, that's not to say that the Biden administration and House Democrats won't try to move something that does raise taxes, which would raise revenue. But I think divided government, as we said, tends to yield little legislative product, and I think that would apply to taxation as well. Matt? When we think about COVID relief efforts under this scenario, you could see, I think, again, efforts by the Democratic administration, House Democrats, to have a bigger package. But this might sound counterintuitive, but I think there's actually a greater likelihood of a larger package under scenario one with a Trump administration, a Republican Senate, and a Democratic House, given what we talked about with respect to spending under President Trump. It's not really a priority. He's said as much. He's not concerned about deficit spending. So you could see a scenario like we talked about of the administration negotiating a deal around $2 trillion with House Democrats and trying to force Senate Republicans to take it. Under scenario two, with the Biden administration and House Democrats, Senate Republicans wouldn't feel any need to go along with a package that was presented to them by a Biden administration and House Democrats. So there's almost no chance that you would have some kind of sweeping, broad, comprehensive, big ticket stimulus package under this scenario, in my opinion. I think there's a greater likelihood in scenario one to get something more robust. And again, I think you'd look at the core elements being help for schools, a revival of the Paycheck Protection Program, funding for testing and tracing, vaccine development, and then Senate Republicans would continue to push for liability protection, although that would be hard for them to achieve under this scenario.
You know, and for this particular scenario, Drew, I kind of go back and use the second Obama term as sort of a reference point, right? Because that would be a similar situation with a Democratic-controlled White House, Democratic-controlled House, and then a Republican-controlled Senate, and sort of what was the ability to get legislation through. And you're right, it was hard. But still, there was the ability on occasion that horse trading did occur, and that you know, somewhat compromised bills came out of the Senate, and then, you know, at that point it had to go into committee and try to reconcile the differences. And that always seemed to be kind of 50-50 whether or not the bill would make it out of committee in a form that could then get reapproved by either the House or the Senate to ultimately be signed by the president. So it strikes me that I think there would be a package. And to your point, I think it would, you know, I think some things would be in there, some things wouldn't. It would be interesting to see what made it out of committee.
Yeah, and the other thing is, Jerod, with cases spiking and the anticipation of a pretty harsh winter with respect to COVID cases, I think there will be increasing and eventually enormous pressure to get something done.
No, I agree. I think this is one of those situations where you would see that.
Matt? Other legislative priorities. So we talked about infrastructure. I think something is very possible under scenario 2 to get something done on infrastructure. To give you an idea, the Senate Republicans have an infrastructure bill at $286 billion over 10 years. House Democrats and Trump, in fact, have talked about an infrastructure bill of around $1 trillion. But I think under this scenario, you could split the difference. We've talked a lot about Senate Republican spending restraint, but they may come up to say 300, 400 billion in infrastructure spending under this scenario. And I think it could be possible to get something done.
Yeah, infrastructure is one of those things where, you know, even partisan economists will sit there and say that there's a multiplicative relative to the investment, right? That you know, for every $1.50 sunk, you're going to get some upstream benefit from that. I think the Republicans, while they had the 10-year view, was they take a longer view relative to that investment when it pays out. Democrats have more immediate timeline relative to the benefit, which is usually tied to jobs creation, less so on the Republican side. But you know, yeah, absolutely, I think you could see infrastructure in this scenario.
Yeah, there's just so much pent-up demand among members of Congress on both sides of the aisle, frankly, to get something done on infrastructure, and such a great need that's been discussed by any number of members. So I think it's a real possibility under scenario 2. We talked about reauthorizations. That is something that we'll have to get done. Number of examples which we mentioned, so that would be expected. And then, you know, potentially a modified criminal justice reform bill. There will be a lot of pressure, I think, on Biden to get something done in this area, particularly because he's taken a lot of incoming on the '94 crime bill that passed and was enacted when he was Senate Judiciary Chairman, something that's not popular at all with the left. So that would, this would give him an opportunity to get right on that issue with his political base.
Well, and you'd see some of the more moderate Republicans too, and the Libertarian wing, like Rand Paul, are very much behind modification of criminal justice.
Exactly. Exactly.
And just because we had the question, briefly on healthcare, I have a sneaking suspicion that that would be one of the most contentious issues in this scenario, given again the focus put on it in this election cycle. And it would be interesting to see what the Senate was willing to do or not do to a bipartisan healthcare plan.
Yeah, and just one more thing on criminal justice reform. It's that would be a fascinating negotiation under scenario 2, because Senate Republicans and Mitch McConnell is, like him or dislike him, he's very good at his job, and he will know that this is a soft underbelly for Biden, and that he's vulnerable on this issue. So he will be acutely aware of that going into any negotiation. I think that will color how things potentially turn out. So that would be a fascinating one under scenario 2.
Very much so. All right, so closing out scenario 2 and moving into scenario 3. Here we have a different version of the blue wave. And in this version, what we have is again, Democrats probably maintain or grow their majority in the House of Representatives. They also take over majority inside the United States Senate, but we have Trump eking out electoral win from a presidency perspective. And so what we have is a Trump administration with Democratic-controlled houses.
Yeah, so I'll just say one thing about scenario 3, and this to me is probably the most unlikely outcome. And why I say that is because many Senate Republican candidates who have tough races are outperforming Trump in the states where they're running. So Trump would really have to pull a rabbit out of the hat to win re-election and outperform a number of these Senate Republican candidates who seem to be polling better than him right now. So that's not to say it couldn't happen. After 2016, it's hard to say with any certainty what may or may not happen. And that's why we have it as a slide. But I just wanted to point that out from a political analysis standpoint. So when you're thinking about business and tax under this particular scenario, kind of more the same in a Trump administration. We've talked about the fact that he and his team have felt strongly about loosening the reins on business across government, whether you're talking about energy, environmental issues, banking, tax policy. Things have become more business friendly over the last 4 years. And I think you'd see a continuation of those policies. One thing that's notable, though, that a lot of people have picked up on, there's no clear articulation of what the president is running on for a second term. And so much so that for the convention in 2020, it was pretty much a copy and paste job from the 2016 platform. So not a lot of thought, certainly not a lot of articulation of priorities for a second Trump term. So politically, that's dicey to campaign with on that approach. But from a business standpoint, I would argue that it would provide some stability. And I think an expectation over the next 4 years that the next 4 years will be largely similar to the previous 4 years, which is generally a good thing.
Well, and I think on the business and taxation front, you'd have to see Mnuchin, Powell, and Kudlow really out there using soft power and a lot of kind of horse trading and working across both, Schumer and Pelosi to generate legislation that while still achieving some of the goals that are critical to the Democrats, you could still see the Fed and the Treasury being willing to kind of sign on, and Trump being willing to agree to against his sort of pro-business stance.
Yeah, totally agree. Next slide, please, Matt. COVID relief. So with a Democratic Congress, they would certainly push for a pretty large package. We've talked about the Mnuchin-Pelosi negotiation. The White House got as high as 1.8 trillion. So I think Democrats in Congress next year would view that as the floor. And it would remain to be seen how high the administration would want to go. Certainly, there would be resistance among some Republicans within the administration to spend too much. But again, if you have a president who sees a need and doesn't really see a large package and a high number in terms of spending as an obstacle, you could see something, realistically in the $2 to $2.5 trillion range, possibly even higher in this scenario. Next one, Matt. Likewise on infrastructure, we've talked a lot about infrastructure. That's because, in my view, it remains the top legislative priority that has the best chance of being enacted. And Democrats in Congress and President Trump are pretty much in the same place when it comes to the price tag on an infrastructure bill. Both have talked about a $1 trillion bill. And so I think what you'd see under this scenario is somewhere in the neighborhood of $1 trillion on a new infrastructure bill. I think where you'd see the rub is on help for renewables, wind and solar, versus help for oil and gas. That would likely be the most contentious thing in the energy package that's negotiated between President Trump and Democrats in Congress. But with regard to the price tag, I think they're there at $1 trillion. So I think this would pave the way to a maybe not an easy process in getting something done on infrastructure, but something that is definitely attainable given the fact that they agree on the price tag.
And then one question we had brought up, Drew, relative to this scenario is that with a Democratic-controlled Senate and a Democratic-controlled House, does the specter of impeachment raise its head again? And could that go a different way given this control? Give your answer, and then I'll jump in afterwards. Yeah,
that's a great point, Jerod. And I think it's entirely possible that impeachment is back on the table if Trump is reelected and Democrats can control Congress. The House, I think it would be a certainty that the House would successfully impeach President Trump. Whether or not you can get to 67 votes in the Senate with a slim majority, I think that's really hard to see. But I think the energy among the Democratic base would be there. And frankly, among Democratic members of Congress, if Biden loses and they have to suffer through, in their view, another 4 years of Trump, there's not much doubt in my mind that they would try that.
So I take a slightly different view, and I'll tell you why. And it's important, kind of in the previous scenario, which I didn't really bring up, but it becomes even more important when we go into scenario 4, is the specters of looming midterms, right? Because for the upcoming midterm, at least on what I've read and seen now, you've got the House is always relatively in play, but the exposure that the Dems have coming into the next series of midterms is going to be pretty high. And so for me, knowing that if Trump was able to again win re-election, then the question, what Chuck Schumer has to weigh, right, is, okay, the states where I have Democratic senators that are in risky situations, if I go and I push this impeachment, am I practically guaranteeing that I'm already going to flip control of the Senate back to the Republicans in the midterm? And then given kind of the margins in the House, I think it's a similar question, because if you talk about something that really served to sort of mobilize the Republican base, it was a combination of impeachment and Kavanaugh that really fired them up. It didn't maintain, but I think this issue you could, and a successful one, would really motivate a Republican base going into midterms. And you could go from essentially what was a blue wave or a blue tsunami into a red wave, potentially in the midterms.
It's a great point, but don't forget the Democratic base would be apoplectic if Trump is reelected. So, and add to that Senator Schumer is very concerned about a primary challenge in 2022 from AOC in New York. And so if the base is pressing him to move forward with impeachment, I think that's exactly what he would do.
Yeah.
Any questions on scenario 3? And I don't think we took them after the second scenario. So if there are any questions on either 2 or 3, happy to answer them.
We had one more question, but I think this one would probably be more applicable to 4, but it's, what about a Biden win followed by Pelosi invoking the 25th Amendment? I'm not sure the context on the 25th, though.
Yeah, so that would be the transition of power. So that, I assume what the person is getting at is that the speaker would essentially say that a President Biden wouldn't be fit to serve any longer. And
yeah, but I think in that situation, you'd have Harris immediately step into the role. So
yeah, I'm not sure how likely that is, just because they're of the same party. And
but with that, let's roll into scenario 4.
Yeah.
So in scenario 4, we go from gentle waves into a full tsunami. And in this one, you see a clean sweep where you've got a Biden administration, Speaker Schumer, Speaker Pelosi, where a fully Democratic controlled government.
Yeah, so I don't know which phrase to use, Katie bar the door, buckle up, any other phrase along those lines, but that scenario 4, I think from a business perspective, the way that I look at it is that it's could turn out to be a good news, bad news scenario. The good news would be there would likely be more stability on a daily basis in a Biden administration. Relationships around the world would be restored because it would be a more conventional administration and president. There would be a more rational, I think, trade policy. And don't forget that equity markets tend to perform pretty well under Democratic presidents. So in my view, that would be the upside. The downside would be a higher corporate tax rate and higher individual rates, and much more aggressive regulation across government. And so, it's tough to see the where things would net out, but I would see potentially some good news and potentially some downsides as well that businesses need to prepare for. And what Biden has talked about is a tax increase for corporations. We talked about increasing the corporate rate from 21 to 28%. He's also talked about raising taxes on those making $400,000 or more. The financial transactions tax, that's something that I think would definitely be in play. And that would be a fraction of a cent imposed on every financial services transaction. And even though each transaction, it would be a minuscule amount, it would raise a lot of money. And Democrats, many of them have talked about using this as a pay for priorities of theirs, like a Green New Deal or Medicare for All or an infrastructure bill. So that's something to be watching for. We talked about stricter Wall Street regulation, which you can count on. Housing finance reform and affordable housing will be at the top of the agenda, certainly. And then we also covered more aggressive regulation across government. So, like I said, I don't mean to be partisan because I think there are potentially significant upsides to a Biden win for the reasons that I just mentioned a few minutes ago, but also things to be on the lookout for in the form of a higher corporate rate, higher individual rates, and more aggressive regulation.
Yeah, I definitely think from a business taxation perspective, you as a business owner, you're going to have significantly more headwinds, not insurmountable, but you're going to have to be, far more cognizant of kind of your tax planning, far more cognizant of kind of business expenses and how you're growing your business than sort of the autopilot that we've been on for the past 4.
With respect to COVID relief efforts, you would see the so-called HEROES Act that House Democrats put forward a few months ago probably plussed up. That was $2 trillion plus, but if Democrats controlled everything, I think it would be at least that amount, and that would be the floor. And it could go well north of $2 trillion up to potentially $3 trillion or more. The other thing that we didn't talk about under this scenario is the filibuster rule in the Senate. And that is you probably know, requiring 60 votes for anything meaningful to pass the Senate. And a number of Senate Democrats for a long time actually have talked about eliminating the filibuster. My opinion is that under this scenario, the filibuster would be eliminated. A lot of Democrats in my firm push back and say, no, there are Democratic moderates who will resist this and it's not going to happen. I just think that if Biden wins and if Democrats win the Senate, there's so much demand to move a number of legislative priorities, and there's going to be so much pressure from the base on moderate Democrats. I just don't see that as sustainable. And one scenario, in fact, I can see is early next year under scenario 4, if Democrats repeatedly try to pass a COVID relief package, Republicans repeatedly block it, that lays the predicate to eliminate the filibuster. And come late February or March, that's when they do it. Now, I don't know that, and it's possible that, as some have said, Democratic moderates will resist it and it won't happen, but that's something to be on the lookout for. Matt, next slide, please. When you talk about other legislative priorities under scenario 4, you think of the Build Back Better infrastructure plan that Vice President Biden has talked about. I just talked about the elimination of the filibuster potentially. Some type of climate change legislation. Maybe it's not the Green New Deal, but expect something in this area, Likewise, healthcare, maybe it's not Medicare for all, but something similar to it. Certainly, criminal justice reform will be on the agenda, comprehensive immigration reform, and then rounding it out with voting rights and election security legislation. So I think what you'll see here is a pretty similar scenario to 2009 and 10 when President Obama was elected and they had a supermajority in the Senate, 60 votes, and a Democratic House. And during those 2 years, 2009 and 10, you saw Obamacare being enacted, Dodd-Frank, a large stimulus package, and in the House, cap and trade legislation that was passed but didn't make it through the Senate. I think they will view those 2 years as their opportunity to move big ticket items that have been on their agenda for a number of years.
Which then sets up, back to the midterm, right? Like, would we see a situation where there's an egregious level of overreach and then you see whiplash occur in the midterms, and then potentially, loss of control in the House and the Senate? I mean, that's one of the things that always strikes me is the midterms being the great equalizer, that when you come in and if you go, full bore, the question is what does the electoral equation then come out relative to that short 2 years that you had for party time?
That's exactly right. That's a great point. And there was a lot of criticism, of Speaker Pelosi for moving the cap and trade legislation when she knew it didn't have much of a chance in the Senate. And so she made her moderate members who she knew would have tough races take that vote. So that's a really good point. That consideration is something they'd have to grapple with.
So that actually segues nicely into one question we had, is that if Dems hold the House, do you feel that Pelosi could lose the speakership to a more progressive member? And one of the things I will say is that in my opinion, I think the only, the more powerful speaker I've seen in my time period was Tip O'Neill. And that for Pelosi to lose her speakership in the House in kind of like a scenario 4 or in any other of the scenarios, you would have to see far more progressive members get elected in some of the races. And I know right now there's probably 2 or 3 that would meet that bar, but I don't know if that's enough to tip the progressive caucus into a significantly more powerful position that would see her speakership get threatened. It feels like she's done an amazing job of kind of concentrating her power base.
Yeah, no question about it, Jerod. And I don't think anyone should question Nancy Pelosi. She is now 80 years old, which is hard to believe. She certainly doesn't look 80, but she has run her caucus and has engendered such loyalty among so many members that I think you'd be really hard pressed to vote against her, even though I totally get the question with the rise of progressivism in the Democratic Party, that you could see why the question is asked, but Nancy Pelosi is a force of nature, so I would never bet against her. The other thing is, and this is more structural, the way that the Democratic caucus is made up, you have different factions. So you have the Blue Dog Caucus, which are social, generally for the most part, conservatives. You have New Dems, which are a collection of members, almost 100, I think, who are more moderate from a business standpoint, business community regulation standpoint. Then you have the Hispanic caucus, the Congressional Black Caucus. You have the Progressive Caucus. My point here is structurally, it is the Democratic caucus in the House is made up of probably 5 or 6 different factions, and the Blue Dogs and the New Dems, pretty powerful forces within the caucus, would be loath to vote for a more progressive member because that would harm their chances of reelection.
So excellent question. We've had another amazing question come in from Samuel Smalling. This is a complex question. So the question is broken into a couple of parts. First, what circumstances or adjustments could we see from a Biden administration relative to support of international organizations, either world trade, NATO, things like that? What circumstances or adjustments would we see from a Trump administration adhering to balance of power and great power politics? And then finally, additional considerations, IP theft, China, and then sort of utilization, the way the Trump administration utilized the pandemic to affect border control policies. A lot of different points here, but one of the things that I would say relative to that is clearly, I think in a Biden administration, you would see completely different re-engagement on NATO. You'd see completely different re-engagement on world trade. The ironic thing is that when you think about the China trade war, I'm not sure how different a Biden administration becomes relative to their policies, whether or not they talk more openness, but then when you look at the what's actually occurring kind of behind the scenes, it potentially could be just as tough from a China perspective, given the desire from a lot of the major trade unions and fears about jobs. And I know the IP would even extend across a Biden administration. You definitely are not going to see the COVID controls relative to pandemic, because if you remember, you've got quite a bit from a border that would occur inside of a Biden administration. So I think that would stop. But on those others, I definitely think it was this. Drew?
Yeah, so like I said, with respect to foreign policy under a Biden administration, I think you'd see a foreign policy that goes back to one that's much more conventional, one that, as Jerod, you said, engages with NATO, tries to rebuild some of the relationships that have been somewhat damaged over the last few years. I think a wild card would be China, and that's IP theft obviously plays into that. You do have this development in Congress where both parties are in a pretty strong anti-China posture.
So I don't think you'll see Wilbur Ross survive from one administration to the next, but
I don't think so. When you say survive,
be invited back to the negotiating team.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, that's something that's interesting to watch, because you've started to see anti-China bills move in Congress and with broad bipartisan support. So I think that would be something that would have to be at the top of the Biden administration's list.
We had another attendee ask a question relative to 100% depreciation from IRS. I'd have to call my father, the CPA, on that one. Drew, do you have any comments on that?
Under some of the scenarios with a second Trump term, you could see something like that happening, but certainly under a Biden administration, I wouldn't expect that. I think that it costs too much money. I think it would be perceived by the Democratic base as too much of a giveaway to businesses. And one example of that is in the CARES Act that we talked about earlier that was passed in April on a bipartisan basis. And there was a tax provision, a net operating loss, NOL carryback provision that was included and had the support of both Democrats and Republicans in the Senate. The bill passes, And then Democrats in the weeks following start to attack Republicans and criticize the NOL provision, which has caused a lot of ill will on the part of Senate and Senate Finance Committee Republicans and Democrats. So that's an example, I think, of how Democrats would view things like depreciation, the NOL provision. I think is a good example of how Democrats would view that.
Next question is from Renee Wilbur, and the question is, thoughts on chances for another possible shutdown, either industry specific or widespread, coming at a government level, or would you see those decisions staying at state and local governments in any outcome? I think if you were to view it through sort of a let's say the blue tsunami, given the amount of state aid that is in the HEROES Act, I think you could see the potential for like federally mandated shutdowns of specific industries, of specific areas, because the justification for it would be the additional aid and grants to cover businesses and to support infrastructure that I don't think you would see either under a divided scenario or a Trump scenario. I think in those, probably the most of a federal mandate might be some attempt at a mask mandate, and that's even a long shot at best. And I think you see far more deference to sort of state actions and state activity at that point.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I also agree, Jerod, with the mention of a mask requirement, and that's a core part of Vice President Biden's message, and I think it should be, because it's common sense. It's something that it's easy to do for people to do. But when you start to get into mandates, and he had actually floated the idea of the mask mandate earlier in the campaign, I think you start running into resistance, because there are disparate views on how something like that would be put in practice.
And so our final question, there were a few more questions, but given the time, I'm gonna pick one last question, and it's don't you feel that under the scenarios that's most likely, you don't feel scenario 3 is most likely, but what are your thoughts on, of the 4 scenarios, which one is most likely? And it's definitely about kind of putting on our psychic hat. And I right now, if I had to answer that question, I think based upon what I'm seeing from a polling perspective, both at state and national levels, that I think the 2 most likely scenarios are a scenario where you have a Biden White House, a Republican Senate, Democratic House, and then I think potentially scenario 4 is probably the next most likely, where you've got a blue tsunami potentially taking all 3 branches. Drew, how do you feel?
And just to be provocative, I'll disagree with you and say that scenario 4, I think, is probably the most likely, followed closely by scenario 3. And I say that because Senate Republican candidates running with Trump at the top of the ticket, it's really hard to do. And he's just not polling well in the battleground states where these Senate Republicans are running. And he's, in many cases, for better or for worse, he's bringing them down. I just think it's really, really hard with a challenging map and so many Republicans having closely contested races, and Trump being at the top of the ticket. I think that where I am right now is a Democratic Senate 51-49 margin. So it's going to be really, really close, I think. But if I had to put money down today, I'd say Democrats have a slight edge in taking the Senate.
Well, there you have it. I want to thank everyone for coming and geeking out with Drew and I on this subject. I think it's definitely
We love
one
it.
that Drew and I spend hours talking about on a weekly basis, and we're glad that you could join us. And I guarantee you we're going to do this again for the midterm in 2 years, and we'll actually come back and revisit these scenarios briefly and talk about what actually happened. So that'll be neat from a retrospective to come back and take a look at it. So again, thanks everyone for joining us in this webinar. I want to thank Drew for joining us and helping us educate and learn a little bit more about these scenarios. And again, I want to thank all of our customers for coming in and joining us. Thank you very much. And we hope to see you in another webinar in the future.
Thanks so much.